Oh, here we go. Thank you, Juan. So good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you. My name is Erin Doran. I am the Director of Research and Evaluation for Catch Next, and today's session is part of our monthly professional development series. An announcement I wanted to make right now, and I'll remind you all at the end. So next month, we will be having the professional development series a week early. It'll be on October the 14th, which is the second Thursday rather than the third Thursday. The reason why we are doing that is because the gala for CTN will be held on the 21st. So we didn't want to be in competition with ourselves. We hope that you will be able to attend both. For next week or next month's professional development webinar, we will have Dr. Rogelio Saenz from UTSA. He has been on our board of directors. He is a demographer out of the University of Texas at San Antonio. And part of the reason why I thought of him and asked him, besides the fact that he's been a great supporter of our work, is I still listen to Texas Public Radio, even though I don't live in San Antonio anymore. And he was on gosh, I can't remember the radio show, but the local San Antonio show that plays at the noontime hour. And he was talking about the 2020 census and the demographic changes that have happened in Texas in particular. And Rogelio is always very good at talking about how that informs the work of post-secondary educators and community colleges and Latinos and large swath of people related to the work of Catch Next. So please make time to be there. Again, October the 14th, same time, and it'll be the same link. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. But now I am going to introduce my dear friend, Dr. Carlton Fong. He is an assistant professor in the graduate program in developmental education at Texas State University. He has completed a PhD and an MA in educational psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. So he is very familiar with that I-35 corridor. And he has done a lot of really interesting work kind of at the intersection between educational psychology and higher education research. He examines the motivational, psychological, and instructional factors that influence success, achievement, and persistence in post-secondary education. And he does a lot of research synthesis and meta-analysis, which he is going to be much better at explaining than I will. So without further ado, I will pass it to my friend Carlton.
Thank you. Of course, the moment I need to start speaking, my computer starts going on the fritz. But I think I'm here and I think people can hear me. Okay, great. Let me share my screen here. My dual monitor, which is like my best friend, decided to fart out just a moment ago. But we are gonna make it work. Okay, let me share screen here. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you were intrigued by the title and the reference to our favorite dog, Lassie. It's unfortunately not going to include many dogs in the content of the webinar, but I do have a number of gifts, so hopefully those will just spark a little joy. But thank you again so much for having me. Once again, my name is Carlton, and I am a faculty member at Texas State University in our graduate program in developmental education. And we recently just got a paper accepted on this project literally a week ago. And so when Erin was finalizing the topic with me, I was like, can I share about this? Because this is like literally hot off the presses. And so we actually started this project about 4 years ago, doing a very, very large scale synthesis. And I wanted to share with you kind of the process about how we went about conducting this synthesis, as well as some of the results, because I think the results are really interesting, especially as we think about and consider and support students in the learning process. And so I'm really excited to dive in with this presentation. So of course, I'll introduce what the Lassie is, and then I will go into some of the research background on the topic. I'll briefly talk about the method as well as the approach we took in the synthesis, and of course, focus on the results. What are the most meaningful and impactful learning and study strategies that we could try to cultivate in the students we work with. And then open it up for some discussion, thinking about, in light of the synthesis, what are some takeaways that we could apply in our context. So as a little icebreaker, maybe on the chat, maybe you can share your experiences with the Lassie. And so it's the Learning and Study Strategies Inventory. It's been around, for close to 40 years now. And so you may have had some experiences, you may have never heard of it, and that's cool. You may have taken it yourself, you may have administered it in maybe one of your classes or in a center. Maybe you've done some research with it. Any and all or none experiences, go ahead and just put that up on the chat and we could kind of see just some of y'all's familiarity with it. So maybe we can take 30 seconds or so just to kind of throw that up there. Okay, we have someone that's reviewed it before, administered it, not quite familiar, heard of it. Okay, so maybe some folks new to it too. That's totally fine. Okay, great. Yeah, keep throwing those on there. So for a little bit of background, it was developed by the late Claire Ellen Weinstein. She actually was a faculty member at UT Austin, and she originally worked with the military actually, and worked with their cadets there on how they could improve some of their learning and their study processes. And she developed this model, which we'll go into, but along with the model, she developed this inventory. It's actually an 80-item inventory when it was first developed, and it assessed a wide range of just different strategies, how to process information, how to test yourself, things like motivation and your attitudes. And she really saw the learning process in a very holistic way, and she wanted an instrument that captured various facets of the learning process. And so it was 1987 when the instrument first got published. And so it's been around for a while, and I think it's been used at least in over 1,000 institutions in the US and worldwide as well, which we'll see. And she passed away. Yeah, she passed away probably about 8 or 9 years ago. And so actually this was part of the impetus for this project. Was she was my initial advisor when I started my doctoral studies at UT. And so I really wanted to do a project that was kind of an homage to her research legacy. And so this kind of was birthed out of that. The model of strategic learning, it's a pretty, like I said, kind of expansive model. So we'll go into some of that. And once again, the Lassie's been used, I think, in many institutions, especially as students, post-secondary students, primarily as they enter college. Institutions might give them this instrument so they can kind of assess, okay, what are some of the strategies that I'm pretty strong in? Maybe what are some of the areas that I could kind of need more support in? And so it's kind of a nice diagnostic tool. But it's also been used, as you'll see, as a research instrument, which I will summarize in the synthesis. So the model is a lot. So don't zoom in. Don't worry, we'll cover a lot of this. But I think the big kind of headers are kind of a summary of what Dr. Weinstein and her colleagues really kind of conceptualized as this grand model for learning, right? And I think what's important first is kind of what's around it, right? It's the academic environment, right? That's whether it's instructors and their beliefs and expectations, whether it's the available resources around them at their institution, of course, the social cultural context, and different requirements for their classes or for their major or for their degree, right? All of this is kind of, and more, right, encompasses the academic environment. And then zooming in, right, their skill, will, and self-regulation are kind of like the three pillars, right? You need to have skill, which is the knowledge or the know-how. You need the will, which is kind of the drive or the motivation to kind of implement those skills. And then self-regulation is the managing, right? The regulation of that whole learning process. So that's a kind of a bird's eye view kind of snapshot at this model. As you see, there's kind of sub components as well. But that's kind of a snapshot of the kind of the holistic framework where the instrument is being drawn from. So the instrument consists of 10 scales that each map onto a strategy. And so the first set of strategies, Claire Weinstein called them the skill, right? The know-how to kind of process and learn information. And so the main subscale that she kind of first conceived of was information processing, right? She was a cognitive psychologist by training. And so she was really interested in organizing new information, how that happens and how students are able to meaningfully retain information and learn new content as it relates to their prior knowledge. Another related subscale is selecting main ideas, right? So you're able to identify the most meaningful salient points, especially when you're, listening to a class lecture, maybe reading your book or your readings. Are they able to kind of draw out the main points? And then third, in this skill category is test taking strategies, the use of strategies to prepare for an exam and also to complete various kinds of exams. So kind of having the know-how of like a multiple choice test or an essay exam or a short answer exam, like different strategies to kind of understand how tests may vary. And you'll see some sample items on the right column as well. The second category is will, right? So your motivation or your drive to kind of succeed in school. And so the first of these subscales is anxiety, right? It's the degree of worry about coursework and outcomes. And actually the way that the scale is coded is it's flipped to be positive, right? So are you able to kind of cope with your anxiety, right? The more you're able to kind of, so that's how the scale is kind of recoded as. So that's kind of self-explanatory. Attitude and motivation, I think, are also kind of clear, but it's your goals, your interests, your views towards school that encompasses like your school-based attitude. And then motivation are things like your effort, your goal setting, and you're able to kind of stay motivated during your schooling. And then the last one has 4, it's self-regulation. So concentration encompasses strategies for maintaining your attention and engagement in academic tasks. There's self-testing, so you're kind of regulating what you just learned, right? It's like, I just processed that. Let me see if I actually got it, right? So let me rehearse it. Let me see if there's comprehension and knowledge building. Time management is huge, right? It's managing just all the tasks, all the demands that are before you. And that's kind of regulating your academic behaviors. And then study aids now has been modified to actually be called using academic resources. But historically, it's been used as study aids, which are the different tools and resources that can increase meaningful learning and knowledge retention. So things like review sessions, things like study tools, like in your textbook, you kind of rely on the review questions or the keywords in a textbook, like those could be useful study aids. So now that you have a crash course, I know that was really quick on the 10 strategies, I wanted to have some more interaction because after this, it's just a lot of more talking, I think. So but gifts too. Okay, so I have a poll everywhere. So if you're on your phone, you can text, or if you're on your computers, you can go to pollev.com. Let me see if I have it on the chat. Yes, awesome. Okay, you can go to pollev.com / my first and last name, Carlton Fong, and then 612. And then you will need to, just out of those 10 strategies, I know it's really hard, but if you were to pick one that you think is the most influential in terms of student achievement, which one would you pick? I think it's activated now. Let me see if I can share the right screen. Okay, can y'all see the poll? Okay, cool. Hopefully they should be coming. It's working. Okay, good. I always get nervous with poll everywhere. I'm like, is it gonna work? So I'll give you a minute or so, because I know it takes some time to get on the site. You don't have to do your name if you just want to skip that step, and we'll just get a sense of what people are thinking. I know it's hard to pick one, but so we have 4 votes in. Motivation has an early lead. Attitude just caught up. I feel like I would be a terrible commentator at the Olympics. Attitude, taking the lead. Don't be swayed by others, just take what you want. Okay, getting some more diverse responses now. We have time management. We have selecting main ideas, information processing. Attitude and motivation seem to be breaking away. Give it another 15 seconds just to, if you want to participate, please do so. Okay, looks like this is it. Okay, so yes, so we have attitude and motivation as 2 of perhaps the most likely according to this group, followed by a 3-way tie with time management, info processing, and selecting main ideas. Okay, so let's remember this, and we'll see kind of what the evidence says, right? Because the next half of this is to kind of review a huge synthesis that my team and I undertook to investigate all the studies that looked at these strategies. And so really excited to share those. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. And that's all the interaction I have. So sorry, y'all. Just kidding. Okay, so yeah, so that's what we set out to do, right? What's kind of the overall relationship between these Lassie subscales and academic outcomes? And you know, I said achievement in the question, but in reality, in the synthesis, we actually found a bunch of different outcomes, and so we'll talk about some of that as well. So first of all, what is meta-analysis? It's the coolest thing ever. No, it's the statistical integration of data from multiple studies that address the same research question. So why, you know, look at one study when you can look at every study that examines this topic and really understand like the holistic landscape of the evidence? And so that's what meta-analysis tries to do. And it does that statistically, right? From a quantitative perspective. You could always, you could still do like a narrative or a qualitative way of understanding the literature, which is super important. But in this case, it's a quantitative kind of summary of the literature. So really briefly, an individual study or a researcher might do a Lassie study on their college A, let's say, and this guy finds a correlation of 0.4, just making it up. But then there's a bunch of colleges and a bunch of researchers doing Lassie studies and looking at student outcomes. As a meta-analyst or as a synthesis, they combine all of these studies together and finds a meaningful average, of course, weighting different studies by their sample size and their things like, and different quality metrics as well. But we also know that every college is a little different, every school is a little different, every context, every sample. So there might be variation amongst the effects to explain, whether there are differences for these correlations or not. So our goal was to do a meta-analysis on these Lassie subscales, and there's a large focus on these malleable factors, right? Strategies, like maybe there are some tools that students can use that can really support their learning, and we can teach students these strategies to become more efficient, effective learners. And so, of course, we want to know what are the most compelling strategies to teach them. There's been little quantitative synthesis work even on this instrument, even though it's been around for like 4 decades, right? And so why not look at this kind of holistically and see what the total sum of the evidence can be. So we think there's implications for theory and obviously for practice, like what can practitioners cultivate within their students and kind of help support students to be more strategic in their learning. And then even like I saw on the chat, right, there are some courses. One I think is like a learning frameworks course that's really built around a lot of these strategies. So how can we maybe tailor some of these courses to use the evidence to maybe highlight like which strategies are the most impactful or the ones that are seemingly most meaningful, so we can kind of prioritize those strategies first in like a learning frameworks course, or even in some like different pathways, right, where we want to really incorporate these kind of non-cognitive or psychosocial learning strategies. So we did an exhaustive search. This is why it took 4 years, where we looked at any student population. We realized a lot of this was happening in the college context, but we were open to younger students as well. It had to include at least one Lassie subscale, an academic outcome that we roughly divided as kind of grades, GPA, test scores, and then persistence/course completion. And then had to report correlational information for us to capture. We actually had no language restriction. We saw how like internationally used this instrument was, and we actually went out of our way to actually find speakers of these languages to help translate these articles. So this is one of my proud moments of like, we did a really thorough job, and I want to kind of show that off. So what do we search? We search, of course, the kind of the traditional databases. We also did, we contacted a bunch of authors that may not have provided all the information we wanted, and harassed them with emails to give us information, and many of them were very gracious and gave us that information. We contacted a lot of listservs, both kind of more research-oriented ones and also like practitioner listservs. CRLA is kind of a mixture of research and practitioners looking at learning assistance and reading. Learn Assist is like a listserv of like learning assistance centers and their directors. And so we really try to do a wide search, both in the scholarly orgs and kind of the more practitioner-centered orgs, because we know this instrument is used kind of in both spheres, right? Used in research settings as well as practitioner, first year kind of seminars. So we wanted to kind of make sure we were capturing that information as well. We also contacted H&H Publishing, which is the publisher of the Lassie, and they miraculously gave us the contact information of all those subscribers to the Lassie, and we were able to contact them to see, hey, do you have data that we can include? So once again, to me, I think this is one of our bragging points of we really turned over every step. And then we did forward and backward searching, which just meant those that have cited the included articles, and then all the included articles, their citations. So we really wanted to make sure we covered all our bases. So really quickly, we started off with around 3,000 reports and their titles and abstracts, and we screened those. And then from that screening, we're like, well, there's about 700 that we feel like might be included that had this LASI data with academic outcomes. But then after screening the full text, we were like, okay, we whittled it down to still quite a large number to 158 included studies. With those 158 studies, we extracted all the data from these studies, and we captured things like study characteristics, participant attributes, predictor characteristics like the LASI variables, and then of course the outcomes of interest. And then really quickly to analyze, we integrated, aggregated all the effect sizes, all those correlations that represent like a linear relationship, right? Like as test taking strategies goes up, how much does achievement go up? Like that linear relationship. We captured that using a Pearson's R correlation. And we did something, this is gonna be like really nerdy, but we did like attenuated effect sizes and unattenuated effect sizes. Pretty much unattenuated means we adjusted for the reliability of the scale. So next we're gonna report the findings, and just to kind of give you some benchmarks, just to kind of picture where the strategies and their correlations with achievement, kind of like how to interpret them. In general, there have been a bunch of benchmarks thrown out there, but I would say in like contemporary psychological literature, we're really looking at these kind of three ranges. So I would say like 0 to 0.1 is like small correlation in the long run. 0.1 to 0.2 is medium, and then 0.2 to 0.3 is large, and then anything above 0.3 is like really large. Education is complex, and so even small correlations can be meaningful in the long run because, and I think it makes sense with these strategies because the more you use them, the more they accumulate over time, right? So that's why I put the phrase like in the long run. So anyway, so keep those numbers kind of in the back of your mind, like 0 to 0.1 is large, 0.1 to 0.2 is medium, and 0.2 to 0.3. I think I messed up. 0 to 0.1 is small, 0.1 to 0.2 is medium, and 0.2 to 0.3 is large. So out of the 158 studies, we actually, bless my team, coded 2,922 correlations. They're amazing. And a bird's eye view of the studies we found, you'll see some descriptives there. Many were from dissertations and theses, but the slight majority was from peer-reviewed journal articles, a handful in reports and conferences and chapters. Their instrument was developed in the late 80s, so not a ton happening in the 80s, but then by the 90s, the 2000s, and from when the search was concluded in 2018, you can kind of see a steady growth in the studies over time. About 2/3 occurred in the US, 2/3 of the studies, but a good third was like outside. So it's kind of a cool international scope of the synthesis. And then the vast majority were also in post-secondary settings, but we did capture a good number of K-12 samples as well. I thought this map was kind of cool just to kind of show some of the international spread of the studies. So once again, a super large chunk in the US, but then you also can see studies in China and Australia and India, Turkey, and the UK, South America, Mexico. You'll see kind of a decent distribution across a lot of these other countries too. Okay, so this is all the findings combined in a very compact graph, but you'll see all of the 10 subscales on the bottom axis here. And then I divided the outcomes because they're different, right? Grades and GPA are different from tests, like, high stake tests or course tests, and then persistence, right, is like this really like important outcome, but it's also kind of a distal outcome, right? And so so we split those out by different outcomes, and so you see the color coordination there. And then on the left axis, the vertical axis is the magnitude of the correlations, right? So we have 0.1 to 0.2, 0.2 to 0.3, and like I said, 0.3 above 0.3 is pretty large. So you kind of see kind of the size of these correlations. So a lot of people voted for attitude and motivation, at least when they began. And motivation, I think definitely has some promise, right? So I just have a few little highlights here. And so just looking at grades for now, right? Grades and GPA outcomes, we see that motivational strategies and test taking strategies kind of are the top two most highly correlated strategies with grades and GPA. So things like students' perceptions of their effort, their goal setting, right? For motivation, those seem to be really salient, at least from these 100-ish studies that we found. Same with test taking, right? We know obviously tests are a part of grades and kind of what often makes up their grades. And so knowing how to approach tests and prepare for them, those seem to have strong associations with test taking as well. Important, but maybe like a notch lower, I think, are attitude. So yay for those that voted for attitude, concentration, and also time management, right? Those three were also like pretty largely had pretty large associations with GPA and grades as well. So once again, concentrating, the ability to really put in the effort to kind of get rid of distractions and focus on what's before you, your overall attitude and views and perceptions towards school, and then also time management, that regulatory nature of your time, your schedule, your behaviors, right? All of that. All three of those also seem to have some meaningful associations with GPA and grades. So those are the light orange. Turning to the gray is for test scores, right? So if the outcome was actual test scores, or sometimes even like high stakes tests, like certification exams or like entrance exams, unsurprisingly, test taking strategies was the highest strategy correlated with test outcomes. So at least that was like a nice like validity check. Like, okay, yes, these strategies actually help with tests. Phew, okay. But there's also some other strategies, and I thought they were interesting. It's selecting main ideas and anxiety. We thought that was interesting, that anxiety was also like coping with your anxiety was a positive predictor of test scores, because we all know about test anxiety, right? And so the more you're able to regulate your anxiety, the better you're able to do on tests. And we know test anxiety is like really huge, right? And then the third one is selecting main ideas. And then we were kind of like scratching our head, like, why would selecting main ideas be related to tests? Well, we often think tests assess the main ideas, right? The tests really capture, like, do you remember, do you understand like the main keywords, the main concepts, the main ideas of this class? Well, that's what's hopefully assessed in a lot of these examinations, right? So if you're able to select those main ideas, understand them, pinpoint them, identify them, then you're going to be doing better on these exams, which most likely measure what those main ideas are. And then for a third outcome, the darker orange, is persistence, right? Course completion and persistence. You'll see that overall persistence correlations tend to be kind of smaller in general, because we thought this was kind of a more of a distal outcome. Like these strategies really help with grades, right? With tests, the things that happen on a week-to-week basis. Well, course completion and persistence, that's a harder outcome, right? It's like whether you're gonna come back next semester, whether you're gonna complete this class, like there's a lot of other factors that play into it. But the strategies we found actually were still meaningfully associated with persistence. And I think the main two were motivation and attitude. So yay for our poll everywhere. Somehow y'all were able to like identify the persistent ones quite accurately. But yeah, so the more you have a better attitude towards school, the more you see value in school, the more you're able to set goals. Once again, reinitiate effort into your schooling. Those two are really powerful strategies for not only grades and GPA, but I think for some of the persistence outcomes that we measured as well. So what are some of the implications from all of this? I think it gives us evidence to consider which strategies should we prioritize in our teaching practice, right? Because I think we're not only interested in the content and in the domain-based knowledge, but also in the strategies that students employ to learn that domain knowledge, right? And as we saw through this project, that there are a lot of strategies, but some strategies are perhaps more meaningful, right? Motivation, test taking strategies seem to kind of come up to the top, even across outcomes. And so I think there's power there, right? In understanding, okay, if I can help students stay motivated, whether it's, helping them see the relevance, the importance, the meaningfulness of what you're teaching, they're going to be more motivated and wanting to put more effort into their work, right? Test taking strategies, demystifying the test process, right? Give them practice tests, have work through some of the logic of an exam, highlight how they should best prepare for the test, right? We know there's a lot of anxiety associated with tests. So giving them strategies to really tackle that on could also be something we might want to prioritize as well. I think also understanding the different outcomes, right? Different strategies are useful for different things, right? And so while, you know, time management, right, wasn't super useful for test taking, but we see that it's super useful for their GPA overall, right? Maybe balancing all the different demands they have across a whole semester, right? And so once again, I think splitting up the academic outcomes and seeing kind of the different pattern of associations meant that different strategies are useful for different outcomes. And, they're all going to be important, but maybe for different aspects and different experiences for students. Also, what strategies do we need to reconceptualize? Some of them that didn't quite make it to the podium, right? Didn't medal in the last year Olympics. Study aids, right? Actually, if we go back to this, study aids were, had some modest correlations, but for test scores, there actually was a negative correlation, right? It's like, ooh, that's not good. We don't want negative correlations here. Information processing, that was kind of Claire Ellen's initial impetus to kind of create this survey. Like, I really want to tap students' strategies for how they process information, right? That's the bread and butter of learning, but perhaps the way that scale is conceptualized, it's not capturing maybe the precise strategies that she was envisioning with the scale. And so I think this also gives us some fodder to kind of go back to the drawing board and say, okay, are there other strategies, right? Maybe some of these strategies like self-testing or information processing or study aids, is this how students approach studying right now? Is this how they approach learning, right? And so updating those and making sure those are kind of tuned in to the student experience is going to be essential to really get a fuller picture of the various ways students have strategies in their learning process. So, I just want to thank, of course, my wonderful research team, Megan Crow, Karen Johnson Ashton, Megan Hoff, Shenji Lee, and Cassandra Gonzalez. They coded all of those close to 3,000 correlations, and so they put in a lot of work to put this whole thing together. And so I just wanted to definitely acknowledge their efforts as well. But now I think we have time for questions and discussion. I'll just leave these bullet points up if that helps to kind of guide things. But thank you so much, and humoring me that you are somewhat interested in meta-analysis and letting me kind of geek out a little bit. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Carlton. So there is a question in the chat from Mario asking, what are everyone's best practices for affecting student motivation in the classroom?
Yeah, that's great. And I think Maria also had that question as well. I love a simple acronym, and I think it'll it'll hopefully be useful. I call it the CRAVE model. And so C is for competence. And so that's, trying to scaffold students so they can feel more efficacious, right? When they're learning, right? They might be daunted by the task in front of them, but if you kind of give them the right scaffolds, they're going to build kind of that natural confidence by getting a little better each time, right? And so I think that's one of those. Relatedness is R, and that's making sure that they feel like they meaningfully belong, right? That's going to motivate them as well. And I think that's a little self-explanatory. Autonomy is A, and that's, do they have the volition, or do they have the control within themselves, right? To choose certain learning activities, to choose what they're interested in for the course, right? Giving them that autonomy is going to help kind of give them that sense of ownership. V is for value, right? They can have multiple forms of value, right? They may value a subject because it's useful, right? It's useful for their next class, it's useful for their future career, right? There's some utility to what they're learning. They might have value because it's interesting. They love it. They love the topic. And so they might have this intrinsic interest value towards it. And they also might have a value that's more about their identity, right? This is important to me, right? This is important to my sense of self, to my collective identities, right? So there are totally tons of different values, and that's going to also be a motivating factor. And then the last one is, I spelled it wrong, E for effort attributions. Those are whether you, for the most part, can attribute things like the way that you did on a test, right? It's like you can attribute it to, oh my gosh, my professor is crazy. That test was impossible. They're evil, right? You can attribute it to that, or you can attribute some of it, some of that could be true, but you can attribute some of that to, yeah, probably could have, spent a couple more hours reviewing that versus, binging Netflix, right? So yeah, so, where you can kind of place some of your effort in more strategic ways, I think that can also be motivating, because you feel like, okay, this is what I can do given the circumstances. So anyways, that's a helpful acronym that I tend to use when it comes to like motivation in particular, which is clearly a salient strategy. So
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Carlton that folks want to either put in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask him directly?
So I have another question. How can individuals or institutions, departments learn more about getting access to administering the LASI?
Yeah. So I don't work for H&H. This was not a sponsored synthesis, so you could be confident in no conflict of interest. But yeah, it is this particular instrument. Once again, I might have some personal issues with a subscription-based model, but it is what it is. So they're affiliated with H&H Publishing, so you could always kind of work with them. I think they also have like trial versions too, so you could kind of try it out and see if you like it. I will say that H&H has done a good job in terms of not just like giving you the instrument, but they like help you interpret it. They'll help like give reports to the students, so they're able to like see, okay, like this is my profile, like these are ways that I can kind of shore up in these areas. And then they also recently designed modules that kind of help say, okay, like you're kind of low on selecting main ideas, like why don't you take this module that can kind of give you a little crash course in this strategy. So so there are some cool things that I will say that H&H is doing to leverage that instrument and that subscription. So yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit. Elaborate on the value of identity. Yeah, that is that's huge, right? It's kind of like when I have doctoral students that come to me and they're like, I want to study identity, I'm like, are you sure? Because every field, every subfield has tried to tackle the identity problem, and they all have different approaches to identity. And so I'm coming at from it from an educational psychology perspective, and so that perspective has looked at identity mainly through an expectancy value framework. And so that looks at things like what they call attainment value, which is like how you identify with the particular domain. And originally it came from a more narrow definition, like just like, is this topic or is this domain, is this class personally important for you? And I think it kind of stayed at that for a couple of decades. And then recently it's kind of broadened to like, actually, I think rightly so, it's broadened to actually think about, no, what are the collective identities, right, that make something personally relevant and important for you? It often isn't just from yourself, it's often from the social identities, the cultural identities that we carry. And so so I think that's where the field ed psych is kind of moving towards. And so I think I'll just stay at that for now for that question. And for a reference on Crave, I guess I need to write a paper because it's kind of just my brainchild that I've been dancing around with for a couple years, and maybe it's time for me to write that up. So thank you for those questions though. I'll add it to my list, that list.
All right, are there, oh, here we go. Oh, Anne has just made a comment. In studying literature, we often ask students how a character identifies himself or herself. For example, in Salvation, Hughes identifies himself somewhat as a sinner.
Yeah. Once again, like from literature, I mean, English, wow, they're going to have a very, probably a much richer understanding of identity than us psychologists. We're boring. So that's great. Thank you, Anne.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, comments, or anything, then I want to just extend my thanks to Dr. Fong for this super interesting presentation. And it sounds like it has a lot of different, our people within CTN, I think, have good instincts for what helps motivate students or what plays a big positive contribution to student success and motivation, attitude, something that I know we work really hard to work with students to get growth mindsets and to really understand how education is so important. So I wanted to close before we close for the day. I wanted to make a couple of announcements. So first off, I wanted to just reiterate that our next webinar will take place on October the 14th, which is the second Thursday of the month instead of the third. On the 21st, excuse me, on the evening of the 21st, that is when we will have our virtual gala. I am so sorry. The other thing that I have been asked to make an announcement about is that on October 28th and 29th, we will have our Ascender seminar. So I am, my goodness, I'm sorry. I am putting the link to that, the registration link from our website on there. You can also find it on our homepage, catchnext.org, under the events, and the Ascender seminar, that registration is available there. Please note that everyone should register for that as an individual. We also have a couple of big things. If you are unaware, Catch Next, and in particular, Dr. Chavez has been recognized by the Gardner Institute and we'll be receiving the Edgerton Award for Innovation. And I'm putting a link in the chat if you want to read about the award or about Dr. Chavez's receipt of that award. The other thing in October that is very exciting for us is that we have been named a finalist for the Excellencia in Education Examples of Excellencia. This is actually the second time that we have been recognized as a community-based organization. So I have put a link to that, as well as to all of the other fantastic programs that have been named finalists. We should highlight that Austin Community College is currently listed there as a finalist under the community college or the 2-year category. So it's going to be a very exciting October. And so I want to just thank you again for your attendance. I hope that you will continue to engage throughout our different events in October. And thanks as always for coming to spend the afternoon with us. And thank you, Carlton.